subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 11th of March 2021 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on the screen. Time-stamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. In our weekly series of the mains assignment questions from the Daily News Simplified videos, this week's question here is: only increasing the age of marriage for the girls will not solve their underlying development issues. Examine. This question has been asked for 10 marks and you're required to write the answer in 150 words. Now the topic related to the marriageable age for girls was covered in our DNS dated 16th of August 2020. So you may go through this particular DNS before writing the answer to this particular question. The link to this mains question for the ELEARN platform of the RAU'S has been provided in the description box below. Those of you who would be able to submit the answers by Saturday, your answers will be evaluated by the teachers and faculties of RAU'S. The first article appears on page number 6. The article is titled as "A Case for a Revamped and Need-Based Public Distribution System." This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy, particularly under the subsection of PDS, Objectives, Functioning, Limitations, Issues of Buffer Stock and Food Security. Now, before understanding this particular article in much greater detail, let us first understand the importance of this article from the perspective of prelims and the mains examination. First and foremost, as you can see here, repeatedly questions have been asked with respect to the various aspects of food grain management, both in previous year prelims as well as mains examination. In prelims 2019, we had a question related to what constitutes the economic cost of food grains. Then in 2020, we had two questions. One question was related to what factors are affecting the price of rice in India in the recent past, and another question related to the minimum support price. Even in mains also, questions have been asked with respect to PDS and various aspects of food grain management. Now the question here is, why is UPSC repeatedly emphasizing on this particular topic of PDS? Now first and foremost, as you all must be aware, India has seen a phenomenal increase in its GDP growth rate. In fact, India has gone on to become the 5th largest economy in the world. Unfortunately, this rapid increase in the GDP growth rate has not led to a commensurate reduction in hunger and malnutrition. Unfortunately, India's ranking on the Global Hunger Index is comparable to some of the sub-Saharan countries. Secondly, in order to reduce the hunger and malnutrition, presently the government is implementing the National Food Security Act 2013. But the problem here is the food subsidy bill of the government of India has increased consistently. So much so that the food subsidy bill has increased to almost around 2.5 lakh crores. So the food subsidy bill of the government of India is in turn making the entire food grain distribution policy financially unsustainable. It is also putting a question mark over the future implementation of the National Food Security Act. Because of this, UPSC is repeatedly emphasizing on this topic of PDS and the food grain management. Now, as a student preparing for the UPSC Civil Service examination, you should be aware of this particular topic both from the perspective of prelims as well as the mains examination. From the perspective of prelims, you should have a basic idea of working mechanism of PDS. For example, you should be aware of the concepts such as the economic cost, food grain stocking norms, the salient features of the National Food Security Act, the central issue price, the open-ended procurement policy, the salient features of the Pradhan Mantri Annadata Sanrakshan Abhiyan. As far as mains examination is concerned, the previous 2 years economic surveys have repeatedly emphasized the need to reduce the food subsidy bill. Accordingly, This topic would become important for your upcoming mains examination. So you should have a basic idea about the current problems and challenges in the PDS system, what steps the government has taken so far in order to reduce the food subsidy bill, and what are the further reforms which are needed. Hence, as part of this particular video analysis, you should basically understand as to how the PDS system works and what are the present flaws in the PDS system and how these flaws can be addressed. Now, the various aspects of the public distribution system have already been covered by me in the DNS dated 3rd of October 2020. So instead of repeating this particular article once again, what I would do here is I would attach the previous DNS video for your reference. Those of you who have already gone through this particular video, you can simply skip this particular article and go on to the next article. Before you go through the analysis of this particular article, I would want you to test yourself through this particular quiz. Firstly, coming to how exactly the public distribution system works. As you all must be aware, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs declares the minimum support price for almost around 22 major agricultural commodities. So once these agricultural commodities are harvested, the Food Corporation of India, which is the nodal agency to implement the public distribution system, comes into picture. The Food Corporation of India procures some of these agricultural commodities such as rice, wheat, etc. Now, the cost incurred by the FCI in the procurement of these agricultural commodities is referred to as the economic cost of food grains. Now, in prelims 2019, there was a question which required us to find out as to what constitute the economic cost of food grains. So what do you think are the various costs incurred by the FCI in procuring these food grains from the farmers? See, first and foremost, the FCI would have to pay a price which is equivalent to the minimum support price to the farmers. Secondly, it would have to incur various procurement incidentals such as the labor charges, transport charges, storage costs, etc. Then FCI would also have to incur the cost of distributing these food grains through the network of the fair price shops. So all of these three components together constitute the economic cost of food grains. Now, once these food grains are procured by the Food Corporation of India, we need to set aside a certain percentage of the food grains in order to meet certain unforeseen conditions such as droughts, famines, exponential price rise, etc. And that is where we have the concept of the buffer stock norms. Now, the amount of food grains that the government has to set aside as buffer, this was referred to as the buffer stock norms until the year 2015. But in the year 2015, this nomenclature has been changed to the food grain stocking norms. Now, under the food grain stocking norms, we have basically two components. The first component is the operational stock and the second component is the strategic reserves. The operational stock basically tells us as to how much food grains has the government set aside in order to meet its monthly distribution requirement under the targeted public distribution system as well as other welfare schemes. The strategic reserves tells us as to how much amount of food grains has the government set aside in order to meet certain unforeseen conditions such as droughts, famine, exponential price rise, etc. So please do note that the food grain stocking norms not only contain the strategic reserve, but it also contains the operational stocks. So once the buffer stock of the food grains is built, next comes the allocation of the food grains to the respective states. Now presently this is done through the National Food Security Act. The National Food Security Act seeks to provide the food security to almost around 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population. So the idea behind NFSA is to provide food security to almost around 67% of India's population. Under National Food Security Act, rice is distributed at rupees 3 per kg, wheat at rupees 2 per kg, and nutri cereals at rupees 1 per kg. The households under the National Food Security Act are categorized into two categories, that is the priority households and the Antyodaya Anna Yojana. The priority households are given 5 kg of food grains per person per month, whereas the Antyodaya Anna Yojana, they are given 35 kg of food grains per household per month. Now we have a related concept of the central issue price. Now, central issue price is basically the price at which the center allocates the food grains to the states. The central issue price is similar to the price at which the food grains are distributed through the network of the ration shops. For example, for rice it is rupees 3 per kg, for wheat it is rupees 2 per kg, and so on. However, the central issue price is not denominated in terms of kg, but rather it is denominated in terms of quintal. So the central issue price for rice would be rupees 300 per quintal. For wheat it will be rupees 200 per quintal. So if you look at the economic cost of food grains, it tells us as to how much money has been spent for procuring the food grains, whereas the central issue price tells us as to at what price these food grains have been sold to the beneficiaries. So if you want to calculate as to what is the total amount of food subsidy bill of the Food Corporation of India, then we would have to deduct the central issue price from the economic cost of food grains. So the formula to calculate the food subsidy bill would be the economic cost of food grains minus the central issue price. Now presently this food subsidy bill for the year 2018-19 was as high as almost around 1.8 lakh crores. So once the food grains are allocated, the next stage is the distribution. Now there are different stages in the distribution, that is the transportation of food grains to the respective states, the storage of the food grains at the respective district headquarters, the identification of the beneficiaries, and the issuance of the ration card. Now this is the responsibility of the respective state government. And last is the distribution of the food grains through the network of the ration shops. Now coming to the flaws in the PDS system. See, when we say the public distribution system, most of us think that the PDS system is about the distribution of the food grains. However, you have to realize that the public distribution system is much more broader, it is much more comprehensive, and it has a number of other components as well. For example, it has a component of procurement, transportation, storage, and so on. So if we have to discuss the flaws in the PDS system, we have to discuss the flaws not only from the perspective of the distribution of the food grains, but we have to discuss the flaws with respect to each of the component as well. So let us start our discussion with respect to the flaws in the present procurement mechanism. Once the crops are harvested, the farmers have basically two options. Option number one is to go and sell the food grains to the Food Corporation of India at the minimum support price. Option number two is to sell the food grains in the open market, wherein ideally the price which they should be able to get should be higher than the minimum support price. Now the procurement policy that is followed by the Food Corporation of India is referred to as the open-ended procurement policy. This is so because the Food Corporation of India does not lay down any quantitative limit as to how much amount of food grains would it procure in a single year. Now for example, every year the Food Corporation of India requires almost around 55 million tons of rice and wheat, which is required to be distributed through the network of the PDS system. However, in spite of this, the Food Corporation of India does not lay down a quantitative limit on the procurement of rice and wheat. So if a particular farmer wants to sell his food grains to the Food Corporation of India, then the Food Corporation of India has to mandatorily procure the food grains from the farmer, in spite of the fact that it has already procured the food grain that is necessary for the distribution through the network of the PDS system. Now, because of such an open-ended procurement policy, in spite of the fact that the FCI requires only around 55 million tons of food grains, the FCI is procuring much higher amount of food grains, which is as high as around 80 million tons of food grains. So just imagine as to what would happen if the Food Corporation of India ends up procuring more amount of food grains than what is actually needed to be distributed through the PDS system. First and foremost, here the FCI would end up procuring the food grains which is much higher than the buffer stock requirements. Secondly, the Food Corporation of India, its economic cost of food grains would increase on account of the increase in the payment to the farmers in terms of the minimum support price, increase in terms of labor charges, transportation charges, storage costs, etc. Higher procurement of food grains by the Food Corporation of India would lead to the artificial scarcity of the food grains in the market. So it is estimated that the total amount of loss which is incurred by the Food Corporation of India on an annual basis on account of the open-ended procurement policy is as high as around 50,000 crores. This open-ended procurement policy is not only affecting us economically, but it is also affecting the Indian agriculture. Even though the minimum support price is declared for almost around 22 major agricultural commodities, the procurement is strong only for the rice and wheat. So this in turn has incentivized the farmers to grow more rice and wheat as compared to the other agricultural commodities such as pulses, oilseeds, etc. So the open-ended procurement policy has incentivized the farmers to grow more rice and wheat as compared to the other agricultural commodities, leading to the skewed cropping pattern. Higher focus on the water intensive crops such as rice and wheat is in turn depleting the water table. It is leading to soil erosion, and it is also hindering diversification of the Indian agriculture. So in order to solve these problems associated with the open-ended procurement policy, the Commission on Agriculture Costs and Prices has recommended that the government should adopt the close-ended procurement policy. Under the close-ended procurement policy, the Food Corporation of India would set a quantitative restriction as to how much amount of food grains would it procure on an annual basis. So beyond the limit, the Food Corporation of India would no longer procure the agricultural commodities from the farmers. But the adoption of the close-ended procurement policy would mean that some of the farmers may be forced to sell the food grains in the market at a price which is below the minimum support price. So how do you address the problems of such farmers? In order to address the problems of such farmers, the CACP has recommended for the direct benefits transfer. Now, for example, let's say the minimum support price for the rice is around rupees 100, but the farmer as such has been forced to sell it in the open market at say rupees 80. So here the farmer has incurred a loss of rupees 20. So this rupees 20 should have to be compensated by the government of India through the transfer of the direct benefits transfer. So through the adoption of the close-ended procurement policy, first and foremost, we are ensuring that whatever food grains the Food Corporation of India requires to distribute to the PDS system, that is procured. And secondly, we are also ensuring that the farmers are not going for the distress sale, and even if they go for the distress sale, they are duly compensated through the direct benefits transfer. Apart from that, we need to fast track the implementation of the Pradhan Mantri Annadata Sanrakshan Abhiyan, which seeks to provide for the fair and remunerative prices to the farmers on the procurement of pulses as well as oil seeds. Coming to the next component of the transportation, once the food grains are procured by the Food Corporation of India, these food grains are then transported through the trucks to the various state headquarters. Now, when these food grains are transported through the trucks, usually these trucks get diverted towards the market, leading to huge amount of diversion of the food grains. Now, according to the Shanta Kumar Committee on the FCI reforms, almost around 46% of the food grains do not reach their intended beneficiaries. So in order to solve this particular problem, the Nandan Nilekani Committee on the PDS reforms has recommended that there is a need to adopt the end-to-end computerization of the PDS system. Apart from that, some of the states such as Karnataka, Chhattisgarh, etc. have adopted the technologically enabled solutions in order to prevent the diversion of the food grains. For example, the state government of Chhattisgarh had adopted the GPS-enabled tracking of the trucks. So through the GPS-enabled tracking, the government of Chhattisgarh is ensuring that the trucks do not get diverted towards the open market and they reach their intended destinations. Nextly, coming to the storage, the annual production of food grains in the Indian market has increased to almost around 280 million tons. However, if you look at the total storage capacity that is available with the Food Corporation of India as well as various other state agencies, this is hardly around 75 million tons. So this clearly shows that there is huge shortage of the storage capacity. Apart from that, we have not given due amount of emphasis on the scientific storage. So both these problems are in turn leading to huge amount of wastages in the food commodities that are procured by the Food Corporation of India. One of the biggest hindrances for the development of the storage capacity in India was the Essential Commodities Act 1955. Under the Essential Commodities Act, the government could declare any agricultural commodity as essential commodity, and on such agricultural commodities, the government can lay down restrictions with respect to what quantity of such agricultural commodities could be stored. Now, such kind of quantitative restrictions on the storage of agricultural commodities had in turn deterred the private sector entities from investing in godowns as well as cold chain infrastructure. However, as you all must be aware, recently the government of India has done amendments to the Essential Commodities Act wherein the government has stated that the agricultural commodities would be brought under the Essential Commodities Act only under certain exceptional conditions. So going forward, we need to effectively implement this amendment to the Essential Commodities Act to enhance the storage capacity. Apart from that, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the government has unveiled the Agricultural Infrastructure Fund in order to improve the post-harvest management infrastructure such as godowns, cold chain infrastructure, etc. So we need to effectively implement this particular scheme as well. With respect to distribution of the food grains, one of the biggest problem is with respect to the inclusion and exclusion errors. Inclusion error means those people whose name should not be in the PDS list, those names are included. Exclusion error means those people whose name should be included in the PDS list, those names are not included. Then we do not give choice to the people either in terms of the food grains which they would want to buy from the PDS or from which PDS they would want to buy. Now, for example, under the National Food Security Act, compulsorily people are required to buy either rice or wheat. Similarly, the migrant workers do not have an option to buy the food grains from the ration shop which is located in the other state. So how do you address this particular problem? This could be addressed through end-to-end computerization of the PDS system, linking the ration card with the Aadhaar card, implementation of the One Nation, One Ration card, and direct benefits transfer for the food subsidy. Now coming to the last dimension of the increase in the food subsidy bill, as stated before, the food subsidy bill is calculated as the difference between the economic cost of food grains and the central issue price. The total food subsidy bill in the year 2013-14, this was around rupees 1.10 lakh crore. However, in the year 2017-18, it has increased to almost around 1.7 lakh crore. So this particular increase in the food subsidy bill is in turn making the entire PDS system financially unsustainable. So let us understand as to what factors have led to the increase in the food subsidy bill and what should be done in order to reduce it. See, on a broader level, the increase in the food subsidy bill could be attributed to mainly two reasons. First one is increase in the economic cost of food grains, and the second one is decrease in the central issue price. With reference to the increase in the economic cost of food grains, as discussed before, the National Food Security Act seeks to provide for the food security to almost around 67% of India's population. So the increase in the coverage of beneficiaries means that the economic cost of food grains has also increased. This particular factor has in turn been accompanied by other factors such as the declaration of the higher MSP, the higher procurement due to the open-ended procurement policy, and so on. So all of these factors have contributed to the increase in the economic cost of food grains for the Food Corporation of India. So on one hand, while the economic cost of food grains has increased, the central issue price has either reduced or remained almost same. As discussed before, the central issue price for rice is rupees 300 per quintal, for wheat it is 200 per quintal, for nutri-cereals it is 100 per quintal. Now this particular central issue price has been laid on under the National Food Security Act itself. At the same time, the National Food Security Act provides that the central issue price for these agricultural commodities can be revised after a period of 3 years. In spite of such an enabling provision provided under the NFSA, the Government of India has not gone for the upward revision of the central issue price of rice, wheat, and nutri-cereals. So this is in turn leading to the greater gap between the economic cost of food grains and the central issue price, leading to the increase in the food subsidy bill. Apart from that, earlier under the PDS system, the money that was required to be paid by the APL family, this was considered to be much higher as compared to the BPL family in order to avail the PDS system. However, under the National Food Security Act, all the households, irrespective whether they belong to BPL or APL, they are required to pay a uniform central issue price. So this uniform central issue price even for the above poverty line families has led to the increase in the food subsidy bill. So the question arises as to what should be done in order to reduce the food subsidy bill and make the PDS system more financially sustainable. First and foremost, we have to do away with the open-ended procurement policy and adopt a closed-ended procurement policy. Secondly, as provided under the National Food Security Act, we would have to go for the upward revision of the central issue price. And thirdly, as suggested by the Shanta Kumar Committee on FCI reforms, as well as the Economic Survey 2019-20, there is a need to reduce the coverage of the beneficiaries under the National Food Security Act. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. The answers to the questions that were posed before the start of our discussion has been presented on your screen. As far as the answer to question number 7 and 8 is concerned, I would want you to find out on your own and respond in the comments section. Now this particular article appears on page number 14. The article is titled as LIC owned IDBI Bank exits the PCA framework. Presently, the Reserve Bank of India is using the prompt corrective action framework in order to monitor the financial health of the banks. So whichever bank's financial health is poor, such banks are in turn placed under the prompt corrective action framework of the RBI. Now this particular article highlights that the Reserve Bank of India has recently decided to remove the IDBI Bank from the list of banks which have been placed under the PCA framework. Now before understanding this particular article in much greater detail, let us first understand as to why this article becomes important from the perspective of your prelims examination. See, as far as your Indian economy is concerned, you have more than 15 chapters to be studied for the prelims examination. Out of these 15 chapters, the most important chapter happens to be the chapter on banking and finance. In particular, repeatedly questions have been asked with respect to the important banking related terms. For example, in prelims 2015, we had a question related to the Basel III norms. In prelims 2016, we had a question related to the MCLR regime. Now, this particular question was asked in prelims 2016 because it was in the year 2016 that the base rate regime was replaced by the MCLR regime. Then in prelims 2018, we had a question related to the capital adequacy ratio, which is linked to the Basel norms. And in prelims 2020, we had a question related to the interest coverage ratio. Now, this particular question was asked in the context of the growing NPAs of the Indian banks. Accordingly, in the upcoming prelims, you can get a question related to the prompt corrective action framework adopted by the RBI. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll first and foremost understand the nature of correlation between the financial health of the banks and the economic growth and what exactly is the prompt corrective action framework. See, presently there is a direct correlation between the financial health of the banks and the economic growth. If the financial health of the banks is good, accordingly, the banks would be in a position to give more amount of loans, leading to increase in the investment as well as consumption expenditure. This will in turn promote higher GDP growth rate, because of which the companies which have taken the loans, they will be able to earn more amount of profits, and hence their repaying capacity would automatically increase. As the companies keep on repaying the loans which they have taken from the banks would have less amount of NPAs. So this is a virtuous cycle of financial health of the banks and the economic growth. On the other hand, if the financial health of the banks is poor, now for example, if the banks have accumulated higher amount of non-performing assets, if the banks are not being able to follow the capital adequacy ratio norms as laid down by the RBI, if the banks are making less amount of profits, then accordingly the financial health of the banks would be poor. Now, as the banks accumulate more amount of non-performing assets, the banks would be required to keep aside certain percentage of their profits as part of their provisioning requirements. So as the NPS increases, the provisioning requirements of the banks would also increase. That means more amount of capital of the banks is getting locked up. So as the capital get locked up, the banks would not be in a position to give more amount of loans, leading to decrease in the credit creation. This would in turn lead to a slowdown in the Indian economy. More importantly, the companies which have taken the loans would have less amount of profits. So whatever profits which they are able to generate, those profits would be much lower than the interest obligations of such companies. Now, normally we call such companies as the zombie companies. Now, if you want to understand about the zombie companies, we can look at the interest coverage ratio. Now, the interest coverage ratio is basically a parameter to measure as to what extent a company would be able to repay its existing debt. The interest coverage ratio is in turn determined as a ratio of its profits to its interest obligations. Now just imagine if the interest coverage ratio is greater than 1, this means that the overall profits earned by the companies, this is much higher than its interest obligations. Accordingly, such a company would be in a position to repay its existing debt. On the other hand, if the interest coverage ratio is lower than 1, that means the overall profits earned by the companies, this is much lower than its interest obligations. This essentially means that a company is not being able to generate sufficient amount of profits in order to repay its existing debt. Accordingly, if in an economy, if you come across more number of zombie companies, automatically there would be an increase in the overall non-performing assets. So, the increase in the number of zombie companies in a particular economy would obviously lead to a vicious cycle of the financial health of the banks and the economic growth. So, in order to prevent this kind of vicious cycle of financial health of the banks and economic growth, we do have the prompt corrective action framework adopted by the Reserve Bank of India. So, as part of the prompt corrective action framework, the RBI keeps on monitoring the financial health of the banks. So, as and when the financial health of the banks turn poor, the RBI would then take the corrective action. In order to monitor the financial health of the banks, the RBI basically uses four indicators. These four indicators are the capital adequacy ratio as per the Basel norms and then as defined by the RBA, the net non-performing assets. Please do note that the net non-performing assets are calculated as the gross non-performing assets minus the provisioning requirements of the banks, the return on assets, that is what are the overall profits of the companies, and the last one is the tier 1 leverage ratio. Now the tier 1 leverage ratio is calculated as the percentage of the tier 1 capital of the total assets. Now when you look at the capital adequacy ratio, it is actually calculated as tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital divided by the risk weighted assets of a bank. However, when you look at the tier 1 leverage ratio, it is calculated as the tier 1 capital divided by the total assets of a bank. So if you look at the denominator in these two cases, in the first case, the denominator happens to be the risk weighted assets. So whatever loan the bank has given, to each of these loan, the bank is required to assign certain amount of risk weightage. All the risk weighted assets is then added up to place in the denominator. On the other hand, for the second case, that is in case of the tier 1 leverage ratio, we just take into account the total loans extended by the bank. So there is no need for the bank to assign the risk weightage to each of these loans. See, the discussion of the capital adequacy ratio and the tier 1 leverage ratio are beyond the scope of this particular discussion. Nevertheless, if you want to know about the Basel norms or the capital adequacy ratio, you can go to the DNS dated 20th of November 2018. In this particular DNS, I have covered in much greater detail as to how exactly the capital adequacy ratio is calculated. By going through this particular discussion, you would be in a position to understand the difference between the tier 1 leverage ratio and the capital adequacy ratio. As far as the prompt corrective action is concerned, the prompt corrective action gets triggered whenever these four indicators are breached. For example, if the net non-performing assets of the banks increases to greater than 6%, then the bank would be placed under the prompt corrective action framework. Similarly, if the overall return on assets of a bank turn to be negative, that means if a bank is a loss-making bank for almost 2 to 3 years continuously, then such a bank would be placed under the prompt corrective action framework. Now, as to what is the threshold that is required to be breached for a bank to be placed under the PCA framework, that is not actually important as far as your prelims examination is concerned. You should basically understand that these are the four indicators which are used by the RBI in order to monitor the financial health of the banks. As soon as a bank is placed under the PCA framework, the RBI can then place a number of restrictions on the banks in order to improve their financial health. Some of these restrictions include halting their branch expansion, stopping the dividend payment. The RBI can place a limit on giving of loans to a particular sector, and in extreme circumstances, the RBI has the power to even supersede the board of directors of a particular bank. Now, as of December 2020, the banks which have been placed under the PCA framework include the Indian Overseas Bank, UCO Bank, Central Bank, and IDBI. And as this particular article highlights, presently the IDBI Bank has been removed from this list of banks which have been placed under the PCA framework. Now, this is what you have to know as far as this particular article is concerned. The next article appears on page number 8. The article is titled as Work on the Floating Solar Power Plant in the Final Stages. This article shall be important both from the perspective of environment and biodiversity as well as Indian economy. This particular article highlights that the National Thermal Power Corporation is set to commission India's largest floating solar power plant at the Ramsagar project reservoir, which is located across the river Godavari in a place known as Ramagundam in the state of Telangana. See, as far as your prelims examination is concerned, you should basically have a knowledge of two things. First and foremost, what exactly is a floating solar power plant and its advantages and disadvantages. And secondly, the share of different sources of renewable energy in the total installed capacity of power generation. As you can see in this particular picture, a floating solar power plant basically refers to the solar panel cells which are mounted on a structure which in turn floats on a water. Now, the water body here could either be an artificial basin or a natural lake. India's first floating solar power plant was commissioned in the year 2014 in Kolkata. Subsequently, in 2018-19, another floating solar power plant was commissioned at Banasura Sagar Reservoir in the Wayanad district of Kerala. According to the recent development, India's largest floating solar power plant is set to be commissioned in Ramagundam. Now, this is considered to be a significant development because it will help us meet our renewable energy target of 175 gigawatt by the end of 2022. You must be aware that out of these 175 gigawatt, at least 100 gigawatt of electricity should be generated through the solar power. Now, there are a number of advantages associated with the floating solar power plant. First and foremost, if you want to install a land-based solar power plant, first and foremost, the project developers need to acquire the land. Now, particularly in a country such as India, land acquisition is considered to be quite cumbersome. That is why, according to the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, the cumbersome land acquisition process has in turn led to the overall decrease in the renewable energy capacity addition. Now, as far as the floating solar power plant is concerned, there is no need to acquire the land. Hence, this will in turn give a boost to the generation of the solar energy in India. Secondly, as you can see in this particular picture, a certain part of the water body is covered with a floating structure. This in turn reduces the evaporation of the water and hence help us conserve the water. Thirdly, if you have a look at the land-based solar power projects, now during certain point of the day, especially during the afternoons, the solar cells get overheated. Now this overheating of the solar cells in turn reduces their overall efficiency. On the other hand, in case of the floating solar power plants, this overheating of the solar cells do not take place. This is on account of the cooling effect of the water. So since the overheating of the solar cells do not take place, and since the solar cells operate at an optimum temperature, this in turn lead to the higher efficiency of the floating solar power plants in comparison to the land-based solar power plants. Nextly, the cooling effect of water also reduces the heat-induced degradation of the solar cells, leading to a longer life. And lastly, as far as the floating solar power plants is concerned, it is easy to clean them because of the availability of the water. In spite of these advantages associated with the floating solar power plants, there are certain challenges and concerns. The first main challenge is with respect to higher amount of investment. In order to install a floating solar power plant, one needs to invest at least 3 times more amount of money in comparison to a land-based solar power project. So obviously the higher investment acts as the biggest hindrance for the setting up of the floating solar power plants. Nextly, the floating solar power plants are constantly in touch in water, and this may lead to rusting of its components. Thirdly, presently there is lack of domestic manufacturing of the floating solar power plants. Most of the components used in the floating solar power plants are in turn imported from the countries such as China, Korea, etc. And lastly, in the long run, it can have an adverse impact on the aquatic life. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages associated with the floating solar power plants. Now, as far as the share of different sources of renewable energy in the installed capacity is concerned, recently it was reported in the Business Line newspaper on February 21st that solar power has overtaken the wind power in terms of the total installed capacity. Hence, this recent development that has taken place in the field of renewable energy becomes quite important for your upcoming prelims examination. As you can see here, a decade ago, the total installed capacity of solar power was hardly around 18 megawatt, whereas wind power installed capacity was much higher at 13,000 megawatt. However, in the last 5 to 6 years, more number of solar power projects have been installed in comparison to the wind energy projects, because of which, as of January 31st, 2021, the total installed capacity of the solar power stands at 38,794 megawatt, whereas the total wind power capacity stands at slightly lower value of 38,684 megawatt. So please do note that among the different sources of renewable energy, the highest share right now is contributed by the solar power. So this is what you have to know as far as this particular article is concerned. The next article appears on page number 9. The article is titled as Cabinet Clears a Fund for the Health Care. This article highlights that the Union Cabinet headed by Prime Minister Modi has recently approved creation of a separate and dedicated fund for the healthcare. This fund would be known as Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi. See, the recent COVID-19 pandemic has clearly underscored the fact that the healthcare crisis can well transform into social and economic crisis. Hence, for your upcoming prelims as well as mains examination, healthcare sector as a theme becomes extremely important. As far as this article is concerned, from the perspective of the prelims examination, you should have a basic understanding of the difference between surcharge and cess and certain basic details about the newly created fund. As far as the mains examination is concerned, you should have an idea of what are the current challenges in the healthcare sector and how these challenges can be addressed. You should also have a basic idea of the benefits and challenges associated with the Ayushman Bharat scheme. See, in our DNS dated 5th of August 2020, I have discussed the basic difference between surcharge and cess. Presently, the Government of India is imposing the health and education cess of 4% on major central taxes such as the corporate tax, income tax, etc. Now, whatever money the government collects in the form of cess, it initially gets credited to the Consolidated Fund of India. From the Consolidated Fund of India, with the Parliament's approval, it gets transferred to a separate dedicated fund outside the Consolidated Fund of India. Usually, this fund is maintained as part of the public account of India. Usually, such funds remain non-lapsable. Whatever money the government collects under the cess, that money it has to be used for the purpose it is collected. Which means, if the government is collecting the cess as part of health and education cess, it has to be used only for promotion of health as well as education. Now the Union Cabinet has decided to set up a separate fund known as a Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi. So a certain percentage of cess which is collected as part of the health and education cess would be in turn transferred to the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi. And as the name suggests, this cess would entirely be used for improving the healthcare infrastructure in India. This fund would be a non-lapsable fund maintained under the public account of India. The proceeds from this particular fund would in turn be used for various flagship schemes of the government of India, such as the Ayushman Bharat scheme, the National Health Mission, Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi, and so on. The administration as well as maintenance of this particular fund is entrusted to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Apart from that, if you want to know the basic difference between surcharge and cess, you can go through the DNS dated 5th of August 2020. As far as the mains examination is concerned, there are two aspects which I had told you earlier. One is the important challenges in the healthcare sector and how these challenges can be addressed. Now, this year's economic survey had a separate chapter titled as Healthcare Takes a Center Stage Finally. This particular chapter was included in the volume 1 of the economic survey. Now, all of these aspects I have already covered in the economic survey video. Apart from that, you should also have a basic understanding of the benefits and challenges with the Ayushman Bharat scheme. The same has already been covered in the economic survey analysis video. So please do go through the economic survey videos in order to get a proper understanding of the various aspects of the healthcare sector in a comprehensive manner. The next article appears in the form of an editorial on page number 6 and is titled as Regulation Redux. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Environment and Biodiversity, particularly under the subsection of Environmental Impact Assessment. Recently, an NGO by the name of Association for the Protection of the Democratic Rights filed a PIL before the Supreme Court. This PIL has highlighted certain fundamental concerns and challenges with respect to the environmental impact assessment, which is normally carried out before undertaking the development projects in India. In particular, the PIL has highlighted that whenever the environmental impact assessment is to be carried out, such environmental impact assessments are carried out by the project developers themselves. So whichever entity is involved in the development project, such an entity would be required to carry out the environmental impact assessment. Obviously, this would lead to the conflict of interest and also affects the overall credibility of the environmental impact assessment. Accordingly, this PIL has called upon the Supreme Court to give directions to the center to set up the Environmental Regulating Authority under the Environmental Protection Act 1986. Now, this particular article related to the environmental impact assessment becomes important both from the perspective of prelims as well as a mains examination. As far as prelims exam is concerned, you should basically understand various aspects of the EIA process, such as the legal framework, the different stages in the EIA, and the categories of the development projects for which the EIA is required to be carried out. As far as the mains examination is concerned, you should have an idea about the concerns and challenges with respect to the environmental impact assessment. More importantly, as you can see in UPSC Mains 2020, we had a direct question related to the environmental impact assessment. The question here was, how does the draft environmental impact assessment notification 2020 differ from the existing EIN notification of 2006. Now, all of these aspects related to the environmental impact assessment have already been covered by us in our DNS dated 12th of August 2020. As you can see, in this particular DNS, we have discussed certain basic details about the environmental impact assessment, and we have also discussed the various issues with respect to the draft EIN notification which was issued in 2020. So if a student had gone through this particular DNS, such a student would have easily answered the question that was asked in mains 2020. Since all the aspects related to EIA have already been covered by us, we will not be repeating this particular topic once again. The link to this particular DNS video has been provided in the description box below. So those of you who would want to know about EIA, I suggest you to go through this particular DNS video. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now the answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option B.